Okay, so we're gonna get into the more fun part, I guess, of this and starting to make this actually look like something. So we're gonna get into the material editor and start to place some stuff. But first, I wanted to show you a couple things that I went through and just added, just to save some time here and there instead of you guys watching me do little tiny things over and over again. So I went in and put the kind of or stucco trim around here. Those are basically just extrusions from our like exterior trim family. I put in a column over here for our porch. That's basically, if you go to architecture column, it's just an architectural column. And under architectural column, I just basically duplicated one of these and made it a 6x6 column, placed it where it needed to go, and then basically added a trim detail that ran around there to kind of header that off and everything. So that's basically what I did to get to this point. I also added the foundation walls underneath our little columns here, so that way that looks the way it should. So now getting into the materials and that sort of thing. If we go up to manage and materials, since we've been applying materials throughout this entire thing, we've got a kind of build up here of gray blobs that are going to eventually populate the entire thing. So if we go through here, we'll say stucco. So we've got our stucco texture here. There's a few different ways we can do this. If we come up here, there's this tiny button up here that says replace this asset. So if I hit replace this asset, it opens a new window. And in this window, if I pull this out, I have appearance library over here. And if I pull this down, there's a whole bunch of options here, including one that's stucco that has a whole bunch of different stucco textures and stuff like that. So I could double click on wall texture beige and say, okay, this is what I want for this. It has an automatic weathering option, different bump maps and stuff like that. I can crank this up and make the wall a little bit more rough in texture if I want to, or I can crank it down and make it a little bit smoother, kind of as we go. So that's one option of how you can create the texture that you're after. If I hit apply, everywhere that we've got a kind of stucco option there, it fills in. The only problem with this is basically you can see this line running across here, and it's kind of splotchy. The splotchy is just the weathering. So if we go back in here and say, okay, I want to take off the weathering for this and hit apply, then it's a little smoother. I still see a little bit of that line running across there. It's fine. It's not too bad. I can use this if I'd like to, or I could go find a Google image of stucco and apply that here if I want to. Another option that you can use that I've used in the past, instead of replace this asset, I'm going to go to default and just go back to that generic gray lump that I've got there. I can select whatever color I want for my stucco here. So maybe I want something that's kind of in this realm. And I would warn that when you render, whatever color you think you've got here, it's going to render much brighter than that. So whenever you find kind of the color that you're after, so something in that vein, I would go like maybe a couple steps darker than what you really want. I don't want it to be glossy, so I've got that taken care of. Then I'm going to apply a bump to it. And basically what the bump does is it's going to let you know, it's going to create a black and white image, and then it interpolates between the black and the white parts of the image, and depending on how you set it, it'll have the darker portions set out or the lighter portion sit back, or vice versa, to create what essentially looks like a three-dimensional kind of texture to it. So if I click bump, it's going to open up it wants me to apply an image. For this instance, I don't want to apply an image. I'm going to apply noise to this. And all noise is basically this little jittery sort of static pattern. I don't want it to be quite that big, so I'm going to bump it down to we'll say 0.1. So that's not too bad there. So I'm starting to see a little bit of texture there. And there's different types of noise, so I could do fractal or fractal turbulence. Just depends on what kind of look you're after. That's not too bad. I think I'm going to stick with that for now, and I'll hit done. And then as I crank this up, you'll notice it gets more and more sort of intense. So you can just play with this slider to get the look that you're after. Now, when it shows up like this on the model, that's not necessarily what it's going to look like when it renders. So if I come in here and let's just say I'm going to set this on like a medium render. Let's make sure, yeah, we're good there. So if I set this on a medium render just to see kind of how this texture plays out, you can see, okay, so my texture's a little too big. Looks like it's got a little too much kind of wave to it. So if I come back in here and go into my bump map here, I'm going to edit this, and I'm actually going to crank this down. Instead of 0.1, I'm going to say 0.02, something real small. And maybe 95 is a little too much. Maybe we'll go like 46. That's fine. So now, instead of a great big sort of thing, now it should be a little bit finer. So that's looking a little bit better. It's not too bad. Starting to clean itself up just a little bit here and there. So I might even go just a step smaller on that. So instead of 0.02, maybe I'll go 0.01. And I'm going to crank this up just a tiny bit more. So that'll give us a decent start for our stucco pattern, and we can refine all of this once we get everything else in here. Stone sill. I can come in and apply a stone texture if I'd like. Normally stone sill, maybe it's like a limestone or something like that. I could do, what color I do that might depend on what stone I'm doing, so let's go ahead and do our stone texture next. I don't want glossy stone, so I'm going to come in here and find, so I have a textures folder here that has a whole bunch of stuff in it, bunch of textures that I've used in the past. So if I go to thumbnails, you can see I have a fair amount of just like interior stuff, but I also have like stone wall textures and that sort of thing. So what I want might be something in the vein of maybe something like this. You'll notice I have a little bit of a naming convention going here. So on certain types of materials, I will go ahead and append a number to the end of it once I've used it once or twice. That way I kind of have some idea of the size of it. So 96114 tells me that it's basically a 96-inch wide by 114-inch tall kind of sample size there. That just gives me an idea of what do I have here in terms of size of image. So if I'm going to pick something here, I don't have a ton of stone textures. Let's see. Maybe we'll go. Here we go. Let's go into stone walls. Here's a little bit more options here. Maybe we'll do kind of a see what that one's like. So, I don't think that one's going to work real well for the look that we're after. Maybe we'll do a sort of, this Copper Canyon's not too bad. Maybe we'll do something like that. So now when I apply this, it opens up this other menu here, and this is telling Revit, what size is this image? Do I need to rotate it? Do I need to offset it? Anything like that? How do I want to tile it? All of that sort of stuff. So this is a fairly square image, so this looks like it might be, let's try like an 8-foot by 8-foot sample here. And if I hit apply, this applies all over the entire thing. So this looks like I just apply it and it's way too small, so let's make this like a 14-foot sample, and we'll apply there. That's looking a little bit better, maybe even a little bit bigger. There we go. That's looking about right. So we've got a stone here. Our Revit color, our stucco color probably doesn't work real well with that. But I might go into Photoshop and adjust the coloring on this. Maybe take a little bit of the reds out of it and adjust that. So that way I can kind of adjust the actual image that I have and change the color of it and apply it here. So we've applied our image, but we have not applied a bump map to make this look a little bit more three-dimensional. So if I go to my bump maps, so I basically took this image and then desaturated it, so that way I have a black and white version of the exact same thing. And then if I go into edit image here, off of this little pull down, and I want to make sure that my bump map is the exact same size as my image here. And I want to make sure any rotations or offsets or anything that I've set up in this image are the same for my bump map. That way they overlay it just right. Excuse me. So I can't really see what's going on here in this image because that's not a great way of looking at this. So I can go to scene and change this to walls and see kind of how this is looking here. So if I crank this up to say 140, that's looking maybe a little too rough, so let's crank this down just a little bit. I do want kind of a worn look to it. I don't want something too crazy. So I can go that way, or if I crank it the opposite direction, then the stuff that was sitting back starts to stick out a little bit more. So I can go one way or the other. So maybe I might go this direction here. That way the kind of, maybe it's kind of a sloppy sort of grout joint look. So if I apply that, now I'm starting to get a little bit more texture to the outside here. And I'll adjust the coloring and stuff like that of this image at some point. So now that I have my materials applied there, for that part, I don't want to apply a material to my poche. I don't really need that. My metal roofing, that is something that I want to come up with a material for. So maybe I will do like a dark brown to the roof. So something kind of in the same vein. So somewhere down in this range here. And remember, I'm going way darker than I actually want it, because when I render it, it's actually going to be quite a bit lighter. So I'll hit OK there. I don't want this to be necessarily glossy, but I do want it to have a little bit of shine to it. So I'm going to go with something like a 10, and the reflectivity I'm going to do like a 3. That way it's got just a little bit, it catches the light just a tad. Not too much though. So the bump map for this is going to be a little bit different. So we don't have any of these options here, and I don't have a bump map for this. So what I can do is basically come into come into Photoshop and create basically a black and white image that just has vertical lines up and down to create the bump map that I want there. So I'm going to pause real quick and I'll create that bump map and I'll basically show you what I end up creating. Okay, so I will show you, basically I just went through and created the bump map for this metal roofing. So basically what I'm going to do, I also took some of the reds out of that. I just opened that image in Photoshop and took some of the reds out of it. But if I go to bump and then I come up here in my textures folder under metal, so basically I just created this image, standing seam bump. Basically all it is just some vertical lines there, and I just need to figure out how far apart these seams are going to be. So if I make each one of these seams like 18 inches apart, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gaps there, so this would be a 7.5 foot swatch there. So I'll hit done, and I'm just going to use walls just to see how this is working. So you can see I have that set up so that these kind of lines sit there. But if I crank this down, you can see the black lines end up standing up, so I get that kind of standing seam look. So the more I crank that up, the more those are going to be pronounced, and I want those to be pretty well pronounced, so I'm going to hit OK. And now I get the look that I'm after with those kind of standing seams running along there. I might need to go in and add like little caps and stuff like that, depending on how much detail you really want to get into. Putting in valleys and that sort of stuff, you can. Usually that I don't end up doing that unless I'm getting into a really intense rendering or something like that I want to look really nice. But for the most part, this kind of gets the idea across without having to go in and model each individual sort of standing seam there. So that turns out looking pretty decent all the way across there. Now we need to get into, so hardwood flooring, that's in the inside. Exterior trim will come in, and maybe we'll match, we'll do something that kind of matches the roof color there. So our roof color was a 44, 39, 35. So 44, 13, 39, 45. So I'll just input those numbers there. I don't want any glossiness to it. I'm just going to go ahead and keep that there. Oh, 35, not 45. Thought that looked a little purple. Okay, so I've got that input, so I can hit OK. All my exterior trim jumps. So that's looking pretty good. So if I go to render this entire thing, it's not going to look absolutely stunning right out of the gate, but we can adjust a few things to make it look a little bit more like what we're after. So if I render this on, I'm just going to render it on medium real quick just to get a general sense of what it's going to shoot out for us. So you can see everything is quite, so especially our roof texture and that sort of stuff, it's a lot lighter than maybe what we were after. So I can come in here to adjust exposure and shadows. Maybe I'll crank the shadows up a little bit just to kind of give a little bit more contrast. And then, so the white point, do I want it to be a little bit cooler, a little bit warmer? I'm seeing a lot of yellow in that. Maybe not quite that much, but somewhere in there. Saturation, I don't want quite that much saturation. My stone is getting a little crazy. Maybe a little bit more than that though. So instead of 1, maybe 0.9. Yeah, that's not too terrible there. And then highlights and that sort of stuff, you can adjust the entire thing so that, do you want the entire thing to be a little bit brighter? Or do you want the entire thing to be a little bit darker? These are all things you can adjust after the rendering is done. So if you ever render something and it comes out way too dark, you don't need to necessarily go back in and adjust everything and then re-render it, you can just stick with kind of what you have and then go from there. Other things, other textures that we're going to need to worry about. This is a little bit too bright, especially if I take this into Photoshop and I play around with the coloring and adjust the contrast and that sort of stuff. I don't want there to be this much contrast between these two. So I'm going to come in and look at my stucco texture here. So for whatever reason, this looks like it's got some sort of self-illumination turned on there, and it really shouldn't. Let's go ahead and see if I can get this back to where it should be. So if we come in and do a darker, so notice how it's illuminating quite a bit. It looks like it's got almost like a light on in it. I think what there's something wrong with this individual texture here. So I'm going to actually delete it and create a new texture. Rename this stucco. So now I can get into a little bit more of the coloring that I'm after. And for whatever reason, it is still illuminating itself. Well, maybe we won't even mess with it. Maybe we'll just go down and use one of the stucco textures that are already built in here. So if we go with something like this, turn the weathering off, and apply that, let's see what that ends up kind of coming out as. Because we could also adjust the texture of this, or adjust the coloring on this just a little bit by applying a tint to it. Whoops, and we need to apply that new texture to our walls. So if I come in here and grab all of this, all of these options here that I've applied, because I deleted that texture, I ended up with a little bit of a problem there. Now I just need to grab my stucco wall and come back in here and apply my stucco texture there. That's a little better. So now if we render this, hopefully we get something that's a little bit more in line with what we're after. So that's not too terrible. That's looking a little bit better. I probably want my stucco to be a little bit darker than that. So if I come in here, since it already has an image applied to it, I can't really adjust the coloring on that unless I wanted to find this buried within the Revit kind of folders and go from there. Or I can just tint it. And if I tint it just a little bit darker, maybe I go with like a little bit of a brown tint and crank that down a little bit and make it a little bit darker. That's going to look kind of weird here, but when we render this, this will probably look a lot better than what we had before with how light that stucco was looking before. So if I render this now I'm getting something that's a little bit better. That's more in line with the contrast that we're looking for, so that when I take it into Photoshop and increase the contrast there, I don't end up with something that's crazy different and it ends up looking white when I increase the contrast and that sort of thing. So now that we've got some materials applied here, we can start to kind of adjust some other little things. The next thing that we're going to end up doing is creating our own window family. So we'll be leaving this model and actually getting into building our own window. That way we can kind of control a bunch of different options. We'll also get into how to make these set back within the wall there. That way they're not sticking all the way out to the very edge of our stone. That way it sits where we want it to. But for now, I might adjust the coloring on the roof to be even darker. That way, all of this sort of stuff starts to read a little bit better um, than what we've got in the current rendering. Because the roof is a little bit lighter than we wanted. We want a little more contrast to the roof than what we're getting. So I might make that a little bit darker. But for the most part, we're getting a little bit closer to what we're after in terms of the end game. So as far as material goes for the outside, that's looking pretty good. We'll definitely get into more material stuff when we get to the interior there.